In this lecture, we'll survey the historical and cultural context in preparation for discussing H.G. Wells's The Island of Dr. Moreau. If animal rights sounds ridiculous to us now, consider for instance that women's liberation movements were also ridiculed just a century ago. In fact, as we've discussed in this class, women and minorities used to be compared to animals not just figuratively, but literally and scientifically. In the late 18th century, the women's liberation movement was ridiculed as a self-evident joke. When Mary Wollstonecraft, a late 18th century proto-feminist and mother to Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, published her Vindication of the Rights of Women, a distinguished Cambridge philosopher, Thomas Taylor, satirized the work by then publishing his own work titled A Vindication of the Rights of Brutes. Remember, too, our foray in class into the scientivizing methodologies that have validated cultural biases and prejudices like physiognomy and phrenology. Animal rights, then, is just as much about othering as it is about isms like racism and sexism. Just in this case, the bias is against non-humans. For us, this is a discussion that exercises our ability to become aware of latent prejudices as well as a pertinent subject of medical humanities. Consider the following numbers to frame our discussion on animal rights. According to the Institute for Laboratory Animal Research, Division on Earth and Life Studies, and Institute of Medicine and National Institutes of Health, out of about 319 million people in the United States, about 4/5 of those keep some kind of pet. There are about 110 million domestic dogs and cats in the U.S. Depending on your source, about 5 to 10 billion animals are killed in the U.S. each year as a source of food. Additional animals are also used for transportation, sport, and recreation. Far fewer animals are used in research than are used for other purposes. We use them to study human health and the environmental safety of consumer and industry products such as cosmetics, household cleaners, food additives, pharmaceuticals, and industrial and agricultural chemicals. Animal research usually describes research involving vertebrates, that's cats, mice, frogs, pigs, and primates, and most animals used in medical research are specifically bred for use in medical research. According to the Humane Society, about 25 million vertebrate animals are used each year in research, education, and testing. But according to PETA, it's 100 million, and according to U.S. government statistics, which don't count mice, rats, birds, and fish, it's 800,000, less than 1% of the number killed for food. About 85 to 95% of these animals are rats and mice that have been bred for research. Even so, according to Humane Society International, animals used in experiments are commonly subjected to force feeding, forced inhalation, food and water deprivation, prolonged periods of physical restraint, the infliction of burns and other wounds to study the healing process, the infliction of pain to study its effects and remedies, and killing upon completion of research by carbon dioxide asphyxiation, neck breaking, decapitation, or other means. In 2010, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, reported that over 97,000 animals suffered pain during experiments while being given no anesthesia for relief, including over 1,000 primates, nearly 6,000 rabbits, over 33,000 guinea pigs, and over 48,000 hamsters. In a 2019 poll by Gallup, 51% of Americans said they thought medical tests on animals were morally acceptable, while 43% said it was wrong. When a new drug or surgical technique is developed, society deems it unethical to use that drug or technique first in human beings because of the possibility that it could cause harm rather than good. Moreover, when scientists conduct studies with humans, these studies almost always require the results of preliminary tests in animal research studies. Thus, drugs and techniques are tested with animals to make sure that they are safe and effective. What are the advantages of animal testing? Some animals have biological similarities to humans that make them particularly good models for research. The polio vaccine, for instance, was developed and tested in monkeys before it was used on humans. And overall, animal testing has been used to improve surgical procedures, pain relievers, antidepressant drugs, antibiotics, vaccines, medications for blood pressure, insulin, pacemakers, nutrition supplements, organ transplants, and treatments for shock trauma and blood diseases. According to the American Medical Association in 1989, quote, virtually every advance in medical science in the 20th century has been achieved either directly or indirectly through the use of animals in laboratory experiments, unquote. Some suggest as well that animals benefit from human research as work in certain diseases and treatments have led to applications for animals, allowing us to create vaccines for canine parvovirus and feline leukemia, effective breeding programs for endangered species like pandas and white tigers, treatments for chronic illnesses like diabetes in animals, and prosthetics for heart valves and hip replacements in pets. There are alternatives to animal testing. These include testing with cells or tissues in test tubes and petri dishes, computer simulation, synthetic materials that mimic human skin, tissue, and organs. The criticism against these alternatives is that they cannot yield a holistic understanding of the body, and sometimes federal regulations require animal testing over these alternatives. Another alternative is microdosing, or administering smaller doses on human volunteers in order to avoid adverse reactions. Animals are protected in medical research, but only to an extent. In the U.S., the Animal Welfare Act details standards for human care and treatment of animals used in medical research. According to the AWA, facilities using regulated animals for regulated purposes must provide animals with adequate housing, sanitation, nutrition, water, and veterinary care, and they must protect their animals from extreme weather and temperatures. The AWA covers guinea pigs, hamsters, rabbits, dogs, non-human primates, pigs, sheep, and cats. However, it does not cover all animals. In particular, it doesn't protect rats, mice, birds, or fish, as the AWA focuses on warm-blooded animals, the first three of which alone comprise around 95% of the animals used in research. Animals not covered by the AWA are especially vulnerable to mistreatment and abuse. Even those covered by the AWA have been recorded as suffering abuse. In 2008, the Humane Society completed an unprecedented 9-month undercover investigation of a 100-acre compound, the New Iberia Research Center in southern Louisiana, where they found appalling cases of cruelty and neglect and filed a 100-page complaint with the USDA citing 338 possible violations of the Animal Welfare Act. These included monkeys and chimpanzees being struck by staff, threatened by dart guns, sprayed with water during cage cleaning, and denied adequate veterinary care when sick and wounded while still being used in drug studies. The study also found that the monkeys and chimpanzees exhibited notable neurotic and psychotic behaviors, including violent self-mutilation, ripping bloody wounds open on their arms, legs, and faces. The HSI suggested that this could be due to inadequate environmental enrichment and high stress. The UK has historically led first world countries in regulations of animal rights. The UK was the first to implement laws protecting animals in 1822. An act to prevent the cruel and improper treatment of cattle was passed by Parliament. The UK government has publicly stated that animals are sentient beings, not merely commodities, and the first general animal protection law, called the Protection of Animals Act, was introduced in 1911 and has been updated several times since. The anti-vivisection movement in both the US and UK spurred animal rights movements in the late 19th century. Still, it can be argued that the bottom line is animal rights are inherently violated when they are used in research. This is where we move into ethics and philosophy. Historically, animal rights has been conflated with environmental ethics. This might be why we often feel like animal rights is not a medical humanities issue, but an ecological one. In the US, both animal rights and environmentalism both begin around the 1960s, when Rachel Carson published a book titled Silent Spring, which gave a chilling account of how widespread use of DDT, a colorless, tasteless, and almost odorless insecticide, was decimating bird populations. In Silent Spring, Carson demonstrated that human efforts to control nature, like insects, often have unanticipated and costly consequences, including damage to human health and other blameless life forms like birds. In this way, she not only challenged the anthropocentric assumption that nature is merely a stockpile of resources for human benefit, but encouraged people to frame environmentally destructive forces as morally wrong. This is different from other environmental views that saw such anthropocentrism as merely wasteful and imprudent, and instead promoted the idea of animals having inherent value and rights. This is where we see the foundation of the movement called animal liberation. Let's clarify the differences between animal liberation and environmental ethics. The surface optics of the two may appear the same. We, humans, are large vertebrates, and so we may find easy comparison with other large vertebrates, elephants, primates, and dolphins. Both animal liberation and environmental ethics movements give these parties attention. However, while animal liberation movements give preference to animals, often mammals, like domestic cattle and sheep, feral rabbits, goats, pigs, and the like, they might do so at the expense of further ecological degradation and erosion of biodiversity, which is where they find tension with environmental ethics. For instance, think of the common debate between ornithologists, scientists who study birds, and groups defending the rights of feral cats. Those defending the rights of feral cats are of the animal liberation and rights movement end of the environmental spectrum. Meanwhile, the ornithologists are on the environmental ethics end of the environmental spectrum. When feral cat populations become high in a certain area, ornithologists will often argue for the immediate and wide-reaching extermination of the outdoor feline population in order to protect the bird populations which are otherwise caused serious harm. The problem here is that humans tend to assume superiority in the hierarchy of intelligence and self-awareness. This is evident on all sides of the animal rights debate. Regardless of whether a person feels superior to animals and thus assumes he or she has a right to animal bodies, or feels informed enough to represent animal and environmental needs, each argumentative position threatens to assume a nearly infallible confidence in the group's attitudes and practices that they may be beyond criticism. As Peter Singer, the groundbreaking author of Animal Liberation, says, quote, "If we wish to avoid being numbered amongst the oppressors, we must be prepared to rethink even our most fundamental attitudes." Unquote. This goes back to our discussions in class about the difference between articulation and representation, other and self. What right do we have to speak for others? We must always assume we possess latent prejudices motivated by unstated warrants that we should strive to force out into the open for examination. Challenging our perspectives means asking questions. Animal liberation and rights movements typically call for basic principles of equality to be applied to all species, just as we would apply basic principles of equality to all members of our own species. However, one of the first questions people ask when faced with animal liberation and rights movements is, what do we mean by basic principles of equality? It wouldn't do much good, for instance, to give a pig the right to vote or to bear arms. Thus, there simply are difficulties in conferring animals with all the legal rights humans have. In current law, almost all animals are considered things or property. They have some protections against unjustified and unnecessary harm, but they lack the power, such as the power to sue, in order to protect themselves from such unjustified harm. Animal rights then demands more than the welfare of animals, that is, while welfarists advocate increased penalties on unjustifiable harsh treatment of animals, they accept the legal status of other species as property and in some cases reaffirm humankind's superiority over other species. In contrast, rights advocates seek personhood for animals. Under such a concept as personhood, animals would have certain inalienable rights, such as the right to life, liberty, and happiness. Under such a concept, animals would have interests that can be protected. For instance, animal personhood would demand that people not eat animals just as they would not eat humans. It would insist that people not experiment on animals just as they would not experiment on humans. And it would mean people cannot own animals just as they should not own other humans. The second question one might ask is, who or what exactly should be conferred the rights of equality? Jeremy Bentham, about whom we've talked before when discussing the Panopticon, is, you may recall, the founder of the philosophy of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism responds to this last question by arguing that ethics should be based on their effects. Referring even to slaves, who were in his own time considered animals, Bentham reasoned that each to count for one and none for more than one. That is, everyone's interests count, and no single person's interests count for more or less than anyone else's interests. In this way, it doesn't matter how intelligent one is or how well one can articulate his or her or its thoughts. This makes sense given that we provide allowances ourselves within our own species for our young, ill, and disabled who may be less able to represent their needs through our current infrastructures. Instead, Bentham argues it matters how one's actions affect others. The question in the end is, what produces the most good or pleasure as opposed to bad or pain? From another angle, the question we're really trying to ask here is, can the subject at hand suffer? It is the capacity for suffering rather than intelligence, self-awareness, or ability to speak which gives a being the right to equal consideration. Thus, in terms of liberation and rights, it's common for people to point to this kind of sentience as the basic requirement for equality. If a being suffers, Bentham argues, there can be no moral justification for refusing to take its suffering into consideration. For no matter how intelligent or articulate the being is, it suffers as we do. So for instance, we can say 5 hens stuffed in a single cage with wire floors absolutely suffer, but a rock kicked down a road does not. Finally, after asking what equality is and who or what deserves equality, one might ask of the animal liberation and rights movements, why? That is, why is it wrong to treat other beings that can suffer as unequal? On one hand, this question can be rephrased as, why is it wrong to be cruel? Whereas cruel takes on a very particular Lockean definition. In this Lockean definition of cruelty, some argue that one must take pleasure in the pain they cause others for it to be cruel or wrong. That is, one simply is either an evil or good person rather than just a person committing moral or immoral acts. And through this thinking, people can easily excuse themselves from charges of cruelty by simply saying they found no pleasure in causing suffering, or by saying that the suffering was necessary, and this takes us to the flaw of a utilitarian approach. As mentioned earlier, Bentham's utilitarian approach suggests that everyone's interests count and no one interest counts for more or less than anyone else's interests. However, this introduces an equation that also allows for the sum total of good and bad effects to determine the value of interests. For instance, with a utilitarian approach, one can kill for food, scientific experimentation, and ecological stability as long as the act serves the good of more beings than the one who suffers. With a utilitarian approach, one could easily argue that it is not wrong to harm another sentient animal, as long as their use outweighs their suffering and the group interests outweigh the individual's interests. At this point, we still don't have an adequate answer to the question, why is it wrong to treat other beings that can suffer as unequal? Do animals have the right not to be harmed? Tom Regan gives us one possible answer. Regan is a specialist in animal rights, and what he argues is that if humans have rights not to be harmed, then so do animals. He's not referring to the golden rule. Rather, his argument uses humans as a point of comparison in attempts to understanding animal rights. In spelling out this comparison, he tells us to imagine a scenario in which the individual's rights must be weighed against the collective interest. For instance, think of the final Harry Potter film. In this film, we learn that due to a series of unfortunate magical twists, Harry Potter's life is implicated with the villain, and he must die in order for the villain to be defeated. It's a classic martyrdom plot. What we learn from a scenario like this is that we are generally loath to sacrifice even a single human being, even when it is for the greater good, because human beings have a value that is beyond whether they are morally good or useful people. Instead, they're valued for simply being human. The same idea is shown in Dark Knight, when the Joker pits 2 boats full of people against each other. While one boat may secure their survival by setting off the bomb on the other boat, in the end, neither can bring themselves to trigger the other boat's bomb. From a utilitarian perspective, it seems plausible that both boats would recognize that if either boat should go, it should be the one with the inmates. And indeed, the passengers of non-criminal citizens discusses this while the inmates recognize what they believe to be a self-evident truth, that they are worth less than those on the other boat. However, the surprise that caught even the Joker off guard is that the boat full of non-criminal citizens does not pull the trigger on the boat full of inmates. They do not take advantage of the utilitarian mindset, and instead once again somehow find it loath to sacrifice human life. The idea is that humans have inherent value. They are valued by someone, even if they are not moral and even if they're not useful. Put another way, it feels wrong to use human life as simply a means to an end, even if it contributes to the greater good. It is this perception that Tom Regan proposes we apply to animal rights. That is, if humans have rights simply by virtue of being alive, then so do animals. This does not mean that animal rights must never give way to human rights, just as an individual human rights may sometimes give way to the collective interest. Rather, it means that a legitimate, imperative reason must be proven. As discussed last class when we talked about medical ethics, we must exercise practical rather than applied ethics.